This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good afternoon. I want to welcome you to the first in a series of 3 seminars on creative retirement. And I think the first thing I want to do is pat everybody on the back for coming through the fog, the mist, which I think is now rain, and the damp to be here. And I can promise you that it will be a full and stimulating afternoon, and we're very, very glad that you're here. This event is the first of a series, and many of you know that and have, I think, signed up for the one of 3 or 2 of 3 or all of them. Today's event is the culmination of work by a lot of different people. And I want to just quickly thank a group who have helped to make this possible. The Emeritus College had a steering committee to work on this along with the staff. And I'm going to say the names of the steering committee members, and if you are here, I would like for you to stand. The following people were instrumental: Professors Bob DeHaan, Joanne Dalton, Robin DeAndrade, Ron Frank, and Rod Hunter. And to assist them along the way, of course, is the staff of the Emeritus College. And typically the staff, when I do this, they're never here. They're always outside. And I think the same has happened again outside at registration. But I think Isha Edwards is here, so Isha, thank you as well. And if you don't know Isha or Charity, when you see them, I bet you'll know their names from your email inbox. So indeed, to all of you, many, many thanks. Now, it is a member of the steering committee who's going to actually introduce our speaker today. And it's with pleasure that I will call Professor of Pastoral Theology, Emeritus Rod Hunter, to the podium to announce our speaker.
Thank you, Nan, and good afternoon to everyone. It is a personal honor and a great pleasure to present our speaker today, who's also our discussion leader. Professor Richard Ward, Rick, as many of us know him, as many of you may know, is one of Emory's most distinguished and beloved emeritus faculty. Professor Ward served as professor of psychiatry in the medical school for 26 years, and since his retirement in 1986, he has continued his involvement in his profession and in the life of this university and in the Emeritus College in a most remarkable and exemplary fashion. Professor Ward was raised in Beirut, Lebanon, where his father was a surgeon and a medical school professor. His father's illness led to the family's return to the U.S. when Rick was 11, and he was raised for the remainder of his childhood in Massachusetts, where he later graduated from the Deerfield Academy and Amherst College. Rick did his basic medical training at Columbia University Medical School and went on to specialization in pediatrics and later also in child and adult psychiatry. Not content with these challenging specializations, Rick then undertook the arduous long-term training to become a psychoanalyst at Columbia and eventually joined the Columbia psychoanalytic faculty. He was lured to Emory in 1960, where he became widely recognized as a leader in child and adult psychiatry. Rick served on numerous boards and committees. He was one of the principal founders of the Psychoanalytic Institute at Emory, and he gained a legendary reputation as a teacher and a mentor of aspiring young physicians and analysts, many of whom have gone on to distinguished careers of their own. As many of you know, Rick is an extraordinary intellect and a delightful and thoroughly remarkable human being. Insatiable in his passion for learning, he has studied at least 6 languages, I'm told currently Mandarin Chinese. He has interests that range widely beyond medicine and psychology, including music, politics, Iran, Islamic culture, and every aspect of the life of the mind and of the university. And he continues to maintain a small clinical practice. With his 25 years of creative retirement, which now nearly equals his time as an active faculty member at Emory. No one could be better prepared to reflect more authoritatively or with greater insight and wisdom on the topic, the psychology of creative transitions to retirement. I only wish to add that though Rick has prepared some insightful comments, copies of which I believe have been distributed to you in the handout, in the packet that you've received, he envisions this seminar as primarily an interactive opportunity. So Rick, we're delighted to have you with us today, and we look forward to an illuminating and helpful and insightful afternoon together. Thank you.
Well, we're going to talk about retirement. It's obligatory these days for people giving talks, especially medical people, to disclose their financial connections and whatnot. So I want to start out by asserting that I have no financial relationship with any rest home, retirement community, assisted living, or the Life Extension Foundation or anything like that. They haven't offered me so much of a dime to give any kind of talk on their behalf, which only shows their good judgment. But Rod has already revealed, my particular lack of qualification for this topic, a unique lack of qualification, which is that although I am now have just joined the august, rapidly growing section of the population, from 90 to 100 is the most rapidly growing percentage of the population. I've just started to join that group. I'm still not retired. So maybe that either makes me uniquely unqualified to talk about retirement, or makes me uniquely qualified to talk about it in terms of that I'm still facing the decision. How many of you here are fully retired, and first let me ask, how many are not retired but are contemplating retirement? Oh, then the majority are in that category. Well, I'm in that category too, so that's good. We can start off on that. Do you want to pull in? I guess, I don't know, I want to squeeze you, but you're kind of spread out over there.
Do you want us to move people closer to each other?
Well, I want to have a discussion. I want us to talk, not for me to do all the talking, but to talk about some of these issues. But no, you don't need to move. That's all right. We're quite comfortable this way. As you know, the whole field of retirement, the whole field of the activities of the senior citizen part of our population is in a state of enormous flux. It's not the way it used to be. The big change, of course, occurred when Social Security first started. And that created a situation where old people who were retired, had a source of income that enabled them to go somewhere and live in retirement. They did not necessarily have to live with their children. So there was a booming industry in Arizona and Florida and other places for retirement communities, and people went down there, and the expectation was they would live for 5, 10 years that way. The children would come and visit periodically, and eventually, they would pass on to the hereafter. And that worked out very well, and that became a great industry. But a lot of problems have developed about that in the last few years. One of them, of course, is the looming baby booming population, which is not looming anymore. It's here in the retirement years. It started in the retirement years in 2006, so it's very much with us. And it's an enormous mass of the population, so that the proportion between those working and those a potential retirement age is changing in a way that's frightening to, I think Social Security can handle it, but it's going to have to make some changes. And of course, the health care costs of the aged population are a tremendous source of concern. But at the same time, people living longer and people staying out of disabilities longer has created a situation where a large part of the elderly population is quite capable of work of one sort or another. And it's easier to work at home these days. You can work from computers. the skills that elderly people have are still needed in much of our life. And so the range of what you can do in retirement, not necessarily not being retired, but being partially retired, working part-time, working at certain kinds of things that bring satisfaction, perhaps, provided you have enough income to support your retirement. Maybe you would want to work and not care so much about how much you were paid if it was something that you really felt satisfied with. These things have expanded to such an extent that it's beyond any of our comprehension to see the range of choices. And that kind of makes it more difficult to plan a retirement. You have to plan, perhaps, with the expectation you may change your plans in the course of time after you officially make your retirement. But anyway, I don't want to be the one who's going to be talking while here. I would lead off perhaps with the first item I put here in the notes, which derives from a friend of mine who at a recent party was just amazed at how he was known to be recently retired. He was just amazed at the number of people who came up to him and said, "What are you going to do with all that time?" Apparently, this is a big preoccupation and anxiety among people who are contemplating retirement. So let me ask you, some of you, will you take off on that subject? Either do you know what you're going to do with the time, or have you figured all of that out? Where are you in this issue? What did you do with the time that you used to spend working? Yes. Yeah.
I'm catching up on 25 years of deferred life, house repairs, all sorts of things.
What particular things were deferred?
An awful lot of housing maintenance. Not as much travel as I would have liked, at least in the past 20 years.
Well, you can't keep fixing the house for the next 25 years, of course.
Well, actually, I'm sort of between jobs right now because my mother is your age and is running a bed and breakfast and a bunch of rental properties.
So you have some work, as it were, that you can do.
Absolutely unavoidably.
Well, yeah. I think that's going to be much more the pattern. Not sitting in a place and playing golf, 3 times a week. I mean, sitting in a place in Arizona, far from your home, but actually being in some place where you can find some other kind of work part of the time. Anyone else? Anyone have trouble with the time? Yes.
I officially retired from Emory in 2004, I guess. I still give continuing education workshops in my academic specialty area, which is statistics, because I love statistics. And I decided a long time ago I would be very unhappy if I wasn't doing some sort of statistical activity. So in that sense, I'm sort of still working in my own field, but at the level that I want. And I also am doing a lot of things that I didn't have time for when I was working. I do more reading, etc. The other, I also have rental property I manage that I own and lots of repairs and stuff. And
Sounds as if you're adequately busy.
so I'm very busy, as a matter of fact. I feel I'm as busy as when I was working, but it's probably not the case. But it's nice. I really enjoy it. Square dancing is another big activity for me. I spend a lot of time studying and doing square dancing.
Which would fulfill the generalization I made that people, I guess, of our type, people in educational and other work like that, probably are end up being just as occupied after retirement as they were before retirement. It may be slightly different things, it may be more diversified, but it isn't as if they're sitting on their hands or anything like that. we're the people around Emory, and I guess most of you here are connected one way with Emory, are not representative of the kind of retirement from a job where you have to turn in your keys and you have to turn in your coats and all that sort of thing, and you're not allowed to come in the building again after that. There are people whose retirement is like that. They're totally cut off from the job they had before. But I doubt if that's characteristic of anybody in this room. It's the kind of, what would be the phrase for it? It doesn't come to mind. It's a total retirement, the black and white kind of retirement. That's not characteristic of this population. I doubt if anyone here has that kind of problem. They don't have access to the friends they had before, or the places they had before, or are just completely shut out because. Okay, yes.
I have a question I'd like to pose to you
Sure.
as a psychiatrist, and that is, are there any studies that indicate that older people have a perception of time in which time passes faster than?
Oh, very definitely. Yes, it is. It seems to pass faster. That's right.
As a consequence of, and this is has to do with the questions I have asked of people who already were retired
Mhm.
or have been retired. And what they say to me is that I never have time for anything. I'm so busy I can't figure out what to do. And it doesn't look as if they are, but they feel it.
Well, okay, that may be a factor. There's certainly no question of the fact that the time seems to pass faster as you get older, and that's true. All along. It starts from childhood. I remember looking back at my mother's diary. There was an occasion when we, traveling back to the United States, traveled through Italy and spent some time in Venice, and then I thought a whole month in Florence. In those days, Florence did not allow automobile traffic within the city. Everything was by carriage, which is interesting. When I looked at my mother's diary, the time we spent in Venice was about 2 or 3 days, and the time we spent in Florence was a week. And that sort of thing. I mean, it was just a total different experience of time than the way a child experiences and the way an adult experiences it. And that goes on all through life. It continues faster and faster until you get to my age and you say, oh boy, 2010, where did that go? That went so fast. Yes.
Is there a reason for that, Rick?
Well, I guess you get asked to ask somebody else. I can't give you a physiological.
Well, I've heard about that, I don't know. Is that each additional year is a smaller proportion of the whole? As you
That's
get more
true,
years,
yeah.
each one is smaller, so it feels like it's going faster. Is there anything to
I doubt if that's the reason. No. Yes.
Well, I certainly think one of the factors that might be an influence has to do with just, if you're 65, you've got roughly 20 years left, and so you want to use that time effectively, so you know that that's basically what remains as far as an option.
Uh-huh.
There's no question about the phenomenon. It is very true.
Yeah. I think it's a universal experience, yes.
I read about a study done a short while ago where they asked people of all ages to tell them when a minute was up. And it turns out that it's very much tied to your age as to whether you think a minute is this length or this length.
Uh-huh. And which way did it go with it?
Well, the older you are, the longer the longer the minute is, because you think it's a minute and 30 seconds instead of just a minute.
That's interesting. Okay. Well, mercifully, maybe it is that when we're elderly, the time does go faster. We can tolerate spaces of time where we're not accomplishing very much. We're not as restless as children are. We not demand activity all the time. We're able to tolerate solitude, and we're able to tolerate time for meditation, reflection. So, any of you worried about what you're going to do with the time after you retire? Those of you who haven't retired yet, Yes.
Well, I retired because my 90-year-old mother was rotating through the Emory healthcare system repeatedly.
Well, you're gonna be busy, yeah.
Pardon, yeah, and so all last year I was a caregiver for most
Right.
of the year. And, but she has since passed, and now I'm thinking, maybe I'll go back and work some more. So I'm not sure that I'm really ready to retire.
Okay.
I kind of felt like it was.
And when you say really ready to retire, what are you referring to?
Well,
How do you visualize retirement? You mean from a job you have or from work?
From work. I mean, I would prefer having a schedule and
Okay.
working.
Well, that means within an
And I love my
organization.
job,
Yeah,
so-
working within an organization where you have obligations to be there
Yes.
in the morning.
Yeah,
and
I
that sort
function
of
much
thing.
better that way.
Yeah, how does it feel when, as I said in the notes, so when breakfast is over and really you don't, what you're gonna do next is your choice. You don't, there's nothing you have to do.
Well, I've only had to experience it for a couple of weeks so far, but we'll see.
Some people find that nice at first, but afterward, not so nice.
Yeah, I have a feeling that today it's going to work out, but we'll see.
So, the whole issue, really, it doesn't seem to be much of a problem for most of us, and most of you, to figure out that you'll be active in whatever you call retirement. Well, one thing is sure about when you retire, there's going to be a change in life. Your life does change. And you don't have a job you have to go to on a regular basis. You're not tied to some organization that's pulling at you that says you've got to do this from 9 to 5, or maybe you just have to do this today and that tomorrow. I mean, a schedule of things that have to be done. When you're not tied that way, then your life does change, and there are a multitude of aspects to that change. Some people find that change, it takes them a while to balance that change. They go through a transition period before they figure out how they're going to apportion their lives and what their goals are going to be. Because there are now opportunities to do things that you couldn't do before, like buy an RV, for example, as one couple I knew did, and travel around the United States for 3 or 4 years, living in RV parks and getting to know other people in RVs and all that sort of thing. So their life was consumed with this peripatetic existence. I think that would get old after a while, but I didn't talk to them at the time when it hadn't gotten old. But I did remember distinctly, I put in the notes, the one guy I met who had always wanted to spend time in his boat. He loved sailing. And so as soon as he retired, his plan, which he carried out, was to take his boat, which was moored in something like in Connecticut somewhere, and slowly go down the inland waterway, he and his wife living on the boat, take all the time to get to Florida. And I saw them shortly after this adventure, and the one thing they agreed on was that they were never going to do anything like that again. So, the whole business of the things that you've waited to do for retirement, I think most people find it's more successful if they can do some of those things when they're not retired and not make it such a big difference, not lay such tremendous expectations on the enjoyment of something that you've looked for a long time, and may end up not being quite the wonderful thing that you always thought it was going to be when you didn't have the time to do it. Now, there are a lot of other things that change. As your life changes, life in the home changes, and I want to direct attention to that. As I said, George Wyeth's wife famously said, "I married George for better or for worse, but not for lunch." And that's very true. There's a pattern of change. A wife is not accustomed to have her husband home for much of the day. This changes dynamics in the home in quite considerable sorts of ways. The husband is now going to be spending a large part of time in a scene in which he has generally been the minor partner. He's not been, he doesn't run the house. And the question comes up, well, who does run the house? Who owns the house? Is it jointly owned by two people, or is it, from a functional point of view, generally run by the wife, and the husband is a tenant at best? And if you take away the husband's office, his sanctuary, my office is a place where I can go to, and my wife doesn't ask questions about what I'm doing there, basically. There's a certain amount of privacy there. When you give up the office, then you're home full time. You're either home full time or you're out doing something, but when you come home, you're home full time. How does this change the dynamics of the relationship? It's bound to change. Or you still have the same pattern of division of tasks, household tasks, for example? Does it still make sense that the wife does almost all the household tasks when the husband is around at home as much as she is? A lot of things have to change. And the question is, how do you make the change? In some homes, the man literally does not have a room of his own. That's true in a lot of American homes. The wife may be fanatic about the way she keeps up the house, the way it looks, and having a man there disturbing it and destroying parts of it, is maybe something that is really not very acceptable to her. You've had your hand up.
Dr. Ward, that can sometimes be reversed. It can be the wife that, the man that retires first and the wife that keeps working.
Okay. These days that pattern is also true. Then does the husband begin to take over the household tasks?
Yes.
Does the husband plan supper when his wife comes home? I mean, I know the husband takes out the garbage and that sort of thing, but what about the other things? And I guess, from a psychiatrist's point of view, what is more interesting is not so much what is the change, but how is the change arrived at? Is it something that's talked about? Is it something that's negotiated? Or is it something that's left to those subtle negotiations that constitute the war between the sexes? How is what they are going to do together during the week as well as on the weekend, how is that negotiated? Is that still the same principle as before? Now you say it's complicated by the fact that in a lot of homes, the wife is as much the breadwinner as the husband is. We can't cover all the different complications. If those issues are not negotiated, if those issues make one or the other person unhappy or significantly less happy than they could be, that tends to create tension. And that tension may break out in various ways, may not be recognized by the couple as to where the tension is coming from, but somebody knows that things are not quite right. Actually, a marriage changes. When retirement enters the picture, a marriage has to change, and it has to, in some sense, be a significantly new marriage, a new contract, a new way of relating. If it doesn't, there may be trouble. Now, you want to comment on that? Yeah.
Somehow I like the way that you seem to have managed retirement. I mean, you say you're not retired, but in fact, you seem to be letting go of your main job in gradual ways.
Okay.
And so that it's not a one day A, you're working and day B.
That's correct. That's exactly right. I manage my own schedule, or at least my patients manage my schedule once it's set up.
Do you
One of the
find
things
that
about being a psychiatrist is that you never.
Are you also reducing then over time? Have you found that you reduce the time that you see patients over the years? Say you've been retired for many years.
Well, it's more true that the patients reduce the time over the years. I didn't take any active steps to reduce it. I didn't take any active steps to keep it up either.
I see, so that's not, I was wondering if you would recommend if we have that option to do it gradually, is that?
Oh, I think if you had the option to retire gradually, yes, I think that's
That seems like,
that's preferable. Problem is, most people don't have that option. Psychiatrists are unusual, and doctors, I don't have to have a nurse, I don't have to have a secretary, I don't pay a lot of employees, I don't have a big overhead. You know, I work pretty much as I'm a corporation, but I'm the only person in the corporation, so I can be a bastard as a corporate leader and a downtrodden servant as the worker, you know, and both in the same person.
You talk about workforce changing. Is there more of a movement to add that option to people? So at Emory, for example, they have people work part-time as they get older?
I doubt if that option is going to expand in a place like Emory particularly. I know of some friends who did work part-time for a while, but I suspect that was at the need of the university and would be phased out fairly quickly. So I don't think they really have that option, because a big organization like a university has a lot of other things to consider in this. I mean, it isn't just a question of, do we want somebody around a certain amount of time? I mean, there are slots and there are budgets and they have to be made up, and it's pretty complicated. No, I think the way in which it is broader in the general retirement population is the opportunity of other kinds of jobs, other things, other places where the skills can be used, and just finding out through networking opportunities that lend themselves to the interests and skills of the person. Now, there's some groups, you know, like police maybe, or like the Army, where retirement is mandated at a certain point. And the question is, I mean, there is no option of part-time serving in the Army exactly. It might be for some things, but... And there have been organizations, for example, who took retired Army personnel and retrained them as teachers. And I believe that experiment was very successful. And a lot of Army personnel became classroom teachers of various kinds of levels. And they just needed a certain amount of training to equip them for that. And then they found themselves doing a kind of work that gave them a great deal of satisfaction. And there was more opportunity for full-time, part-time, and that sort of thing in various aspects of education. So that's what I had in mind. It's the manifold expansion of various kinds of tasks which lend themselves to being done on a part-time basis, and lend themselves to be done not necessarily in a strictly disciplined office setting, and that sort of thing, which people with skills can tap into. Yes?
I have two questions. One, on the previous topic of this newer model of where the wife continues to work.
Right.
And the husband is at home. Is there enough experience to know about the kinds of issues that the husband needs to be aware of if they're going to be in that situation? Key issues that are important for making that successful. My second question is on kind of this topic of what do we know about people who retire and continue to work for a salary, maybe part-time, or do something at a lower level of intensity, but still get a salary, as opposed to those that work perhaps part-time in community or volunteer areas and they don't get a salary? Is there any difference in satisfaction? Is the salary important? So those are my two questions, and I'm sorry there's some disparity.
I don't know that I can answer the first one. I certainly have not had personal experience with the issues that arise when a wife continues to work and the husband takes over more and more of the home role. But I would think, just offhand, that is an example of a situation where there needs to be negotiation, interaction to arrive at what seems to be a mutually fair and satisfactory arrangement in the home, and that it has to be paid attention to, that it won't solve itself. It has to pay attention to the preferences and the needs of the individuals involved. And it would seem to me that it would not be quickly settled, because people wouldn't always know what they wanted. They'd have to experiment. So a great premium would be placed upon flexibility. Some people are flexible, some people are not flexible. And when they're not flexible, I think you might have some problems with that. With regard to the other, what was it again?
Salary versus no salary.
Working part-time
Yeah.
after retirement.
Whether the salary is important, well, in our culture, of course, salary is one of the main indications that you're worth something, that you count for something. That's where we get most of our affirmation, or at least a large part of our affirmation in our work life. The fact that we mean something to somebody, that we're doing something that's important for other people, they're enough for them to try to pay for it. Now, in many volunteer organizations, there isn't a salary, but there is a great effort to create a feeling that the work is worth something, to create that kind of affirmation. How successful it is, I don't know on the whole. I haven't had personal experience with patients who are in that kind of situation. I have some with patients who did a lot of volunteer work, but in this instance, generally they had a lot of appreciation because they brought considerable skills to the volunteer situation that the organization would not have had otherwise. And so they got a fair amount of affirmation from that. How big a factor salary would be, I don't know. That would require some kind of study, and that's really not my field. Does anyone know?
Yes.
I don't know, but I'm guessing that, economics plays a big role if you don't have sufficient funds.
Oh, yeah.
To do what you want to do, and certainly the notion of civic engagement, sort of revisiting, channeling your energy into areas that you can relate to and that you believe have social value, are probably just as satisfying as a paycheck in the mail.
I believe one of our seminars is going to be on the financial aspects of retirement. So in a sense, I'm not dealing with that here because it's going to be dealt with elsewhere. But obviously, one of the basis of any kind of success in retirement is having enough money to live on and not being driven by the fear of not having funds to continue. Yes?
I think this gentleman here has an answer.
I think it's quite a different issue whether you have enough money to live on, and that's not what I'm talking about.
Right.
But the Times, New York Times, about a year ago, published a study, I'm sure we could look it up, that examined retired people who worked for money and not for money when they had the option.
Right.
Satisfaction was much higher without an income, without a salary.
Without a salary.
I found that extremely striking. I think what it says is, when the money is not a factor, you pick what you really, really, really want to do. That's the way I interpret it anyway.
Yeah, I would interpret it also that you really have the choice to do what you want to do rather than do something because that's where the money is. I mean, that's the problem of people at work, that they often have to work in a job that really does not bring them that satisfaction or that actually is unpleasant in some sorts of ways. And when they retire and they do something else, they can, if they're not primarily dependent upon the money, they can do what would bring them satisfaction, like teaching, for example. For some people, that's a lot of satisfaction, and they're not going to get much money from it, and they'll probably be happier doing that. Yes?
Could we talk a little bit about this idea of having space, the man having his own space? Is that a positive thing? Like, say you have a place in the basement or something where he keeps all his tools and computer stuff and all that kind of stuff. So that, is that good for him to keep that kind of separate space when you're both home all the time, or is that going to separate you? Maybe.
Well, I guess what you're talking about can be divided into two things. Do many men feel the need to have some space outside the home that they can retreat to? And the other question is, within the home, does a man generally need to have some place which runs by his rules rather than by the rules of the mistress of the household.
And for the woman too,
What?
for him to have that space.
I tend to feel, that there was a psychologist who wrote, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus, had a big thing about men having their own cave that they could retreat to, that men needed a place to go to where they could think and be freed from whatever was they experienced as the nagging interaction with a wife who was critical a large part of the time or whatever. But anyway, they needed to get away. Now, I don't know that that has been demonstrated on a really good psychological basis, but I tend to buy into it a little bit. Yes, yes.
Well, it goes the other way too. I think, was it Virginia Woolf who wrote A Room of One's Own?
Yes.
My wife has a room where she does her music and computer things, and sometimes I won't see her for hours at a time.
Yeah, I think that's true for both people.
Yeah.
I think if your house permits it, I think it's important for each one to have a place in the house which is their own sanctuary, and they can retreat to and do something. Maybe it's a place where my wife has a lace corner. She does bobbin lace, and this corner of the basement is where her lace is, and she can be down there for hours and very happy. I have my office there, which is a total mess, but it has lots of computer equipment in it, and of course books and all the things that I'm involved with projects. And she says it's impossible to vacuum in there, and we kind of respect our own, each our own area. I think that's important. The other question, though, does a man need a place away, a sanctuary? Now, many men had that during the time they were working. I mean, it could be, of course, the place they worked was not a very pleasant place to be, or didn't afford very much individual privacy, or it could be they had an office that, I like my office very much. It's a place I can take a nap in, among other things, if I don't have something I have to see. It's a place I can certainly read. I don't know that I've ever used it as a place to retreat from my wife. But it is available as a place that's my own, which she clearly respects. She doesn't object to my going to it. And that's a little closer to what John, what's his name, was talking about in Men Are From Mars. Yes?
Yeah, just to spin the conversation in another direction. Is there a correlation between the quality or even longevity of life as a function of whether you are married or unmarried or single in your later ages?
Oh, there are some correlations there, and they're kind of important. Married people live longer. There's no question about that. And I think that's especially true with men. But that probably is the mutual help aspect of marriage, most of all. If you talk about the quality of relationship, the interesting study is the one that I mentioned in my notes, which is that it's been shown that women who maintain some degree of close friendships, people they are, another woman that they're close to, tend to do better than women who don't. That's health-wise, even longevity. Interesting enough, men don't work that way. You can't show that effect with men. Men maintaining close friendships with other men doesn't seem to have an effect. And marriage doesn't seem to work either in that sense. The overall longevity thing with marriage and with self-help is clear, but in terms of quality of relationships. So, you can speculate on what that's about. I can speculate. I have my theories as a psychiatrist. And I think what's very obvious is that women talk to each other much more than men do. Women communicate more of themselves in their relationships. Not necessarily between husband and wife. Some husband and wife combines where there isn't an awful lot of conversation. They work well together, but they don't really communicate much of the inner selves to each other. And as for men, we go back to the days. What was the character who had us all beating drums in the forest? Do you remember that? And writing poetry? What?
Bly.
Yeah, Bly. Well, I remember I had a patient back at that time, and I had a patient, Okay. And one of the things he did was he belonged to a group of some other men. There were about 6 of them, and they met on a regular basis as a men's group. It was not part of the Robert Bly thing, but it was going on at the same time. And they were clearly not like the women's group that we have, that meets. Their activity, as far as I could determine, was almost entirely watching football games and watching horror movies. How much communication there really was between them, I was never able to discern. But that's what they did. They got a movie every time when they got together, and they watched the movie, or if there was a football game on, they watched the football game. That was the men's group communication. I'm sorry, that may be a jaundiced way of presenting it, but at least that's the way I understood it at the time. That gets down to the issue of are friendships important in retirement years? Do people plan for friendships in the retirement? When they decide where they're going to retire, they're going to move, let's say, from their present, do they think about the opportunities for maintaining friendships they have and developing new friendships, maybe? That's a pretty important part of survival in elderly life, is friendship patterns and communication with other people. I had a colleague back in the days when I was in psychoanalytic school, who was somewhat ahead of me, who was a psychiatrist at the Brooklyn Old Persons Home. It was a Jewish home. And he did psychotherapy in that home with the elderly inmates. And he found that psychotherapy didn't have to be the way it was in office practice. Matter of fact, people generally did not sustain three-quarter of an hour sessions or that sort of thing when they were elderly. They generally wanted to talk for 10 or 15 minutes. But it was very important that they have somebody that they could talk to on a fairly regular basis for 10 or 15 minutes. It had a considerable effect on their comfort and in living. They were, of course, living in an old person's home. They were not living with spouses and that sort of thing. But I was impressed by the degree to which these people needed to talk, and it was difficult for them to talk to some of their fellow inmates in the old person's home. They needed some neutral person to talk to complain to, or just to tell their story, that sort of thing. They didn't need a lot, but they needed communication. Now, a lot of us, have a great part of our friendship patterns are around our place of work. So the question is, when you stop working at that place, do you retain the same friends? Or do the friends, some change and some don't? And some of them turn out to be friends, and others turn out to be people who, for whom you were important while you were working with them, perhaps because of the work, or perhaps because you had some power in the organization or whatnot, and they turn out later not to be interested particularly in keeping a friendship. In retirement, there are often bitter disappointments of that sort. But the quality of friendships and the quality of access to friends, general research tends to show that we have fewer friends these days than we used to have a generation or two ago. Used to be an average of about 4 close friends. It's down to something like 3. That has something to do with the way in which we live, the way we live separately, that sort of thing. And maintaining friendships takes an effort. I mean, you can't maintain a friendship without investing in the friendships. And so when people don't make that effort, the friends tend to fall off. That, I would say, from a psychiatrist's point of view, is a serious matter. And I'm not so sure that people always think about it as seriously as it deserves to be thought about. Yes?
I just wanted to be sure I understood you correctly. You say 2 or 3 close friends?
2 or 3 what?
Close friends is the norm?
No, that study was just the number that would be defined as friends. They wouldn't say they were necessarily close. I would think some close friend, maybe 1 or 2, would be important, but I'm not so sure that we need to have a whole bunch.
I'm just surprised the number's that small.
No, I would think. I think the issue is not so much how many friends you have or what you do with them. The issue is somebody whom you talk to genuinely and honestly at least part of the time. Some of the same things can be shown to be accomplished by memoir writing, by anything that gets a person to put thoughts and feelings down on paper, has been shown to have some of the same values. It's a way of maintaining contact with your emotional inner self. And unfortunately, and of course this is one of the reasons why psychiatrists or psychotherapists anyway exist, unfortunately, this is not something, maintaining contact with your inner self is not something we human beings can do alone. We need somebody to interact with. That's the way our emotional system is set up. It is interactive. It doesn't operate until it's stirred into activity by some kind of interaction with another person. Interaction with a dog, that for some people that's terribly important, but I don't know that it really gets down to some of the things that one needs to get down to. Yes?
The friendship issue is I think really terribly interesting for retirement. I always thought that really close friends were people you knew earlier in your life. That is, you make certain very good friends, sometimes in college, sometimes just after. But it seemed, at least to me and also to my wife, to be more difficult to develop close friendships as we grew older. We had a wider circle in some ways, but close friendship was more difficult. But one of the fascinating things about retirement has been that it gives you the time to actually invest in some other people whom you might not have known that well before.
That's right.
And this has
very
been a very
And there's immediate problems
pleasant
coming up.
surprise.
One of the problems with the retirement years is that your friends die.
Yeah.
You have a close friend, somebody you've known all your life long, and they develop a cancer and they're gone in a year or so. Then what do? You say, well, I'll never be close to anybody again? I mean, no, that's not life. You've got to have the courage to make new friends and to open and find people that you can open up to. Spouse dying, of course, is the worst. No, maybe not worse. The children dying are worse.
Rick, I'll make the observation, my own experience, is that maintaining good friendships with my colleagues who are still working has proved to be very difficult. They are very busy.
That's right. That's why we have fewer friends these days. Our pattern of work makes it difficult for people to invest in friendships.
That was a surprise to me. I thought that I would have time and would be able to cultivate those relationships. And in fact, it's worked just the opposite.
Well, I'm not surprised. And of course, the same thing can happen if you have children, you have a sick child, or you have something aspect with children that demands all your attention. That tends to cut down on your ability to invest in any kind of friendship. Those are very, very, very real problems. Yes?
Is it too early to tell if social networking is having a positive effect on relationships among older people?
The computer?
I would think so. Well, you mean relating to the computer?
I'm asking if you have
communicating on Twitter, for example, or Facebook?
Right, all of those things, or just email.
For me, that's an uncharted area. That doesn't mean I am on Twitter, I'm not on Facebook. But I'm afraid I don't use it as much as I should. But I have a daughter who does a lot. But I don't know that she would say she's interested, but I don't know that she develops friends over that particularly. But some people do.
And people talk very openly in that environment, is what I've observed. And that may meet some of that emotional need that you've been talking. That's what I'm curious about.
I'm curious too, but I really don't have it.
Maybe it's like a public journal.
Well, so it's memoir writing.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's public.
Even better. My memoirs are pretty interesting.
In the past, in traditional societies and village societies, older people were often looked to and often interacted with, I think, younger people. They were looked at as mentors. I'm just wondering how much is known about the importance for older people who have retired to stay involved with younger people
I think it's important. I think it's important for younger people to stay involved with older people. I'm afraid our pattern of living in the past 50 years has militated against that. We live separately, you know. We used to live more together. You could generally, if you lived in a city, for example, you might have elements of your family around within the block, down the block. You knew your grandmother because she lived somewhere close to you. We don't live close anymore. It requires an automobile trip to get somewhere, or perhaps even go to a different city. That's hard. So those relationships get attenuated by lack of abuse. Because it's not much how much you love your grandmother, but how much do you get to interact with her? How much of a real person is she for your children?
Well, I'm even thinking of extra familial. I mean, there are young people, regardless of whether you're related to them,
Right.
that might benefit from someone who has some distance, some experience, is maybe non-judgmental.
Oh, I think that's very true, and I think the Emeritus College has tried to foster these things with college students and emeritus people into relationships of that sort of thing.
Here's an example.
Unfortunately, they have, and there are organizations that do this, you know, Big Brother organizations and whatnot, and I'm sure they do a good job. It's just that they're kind of running against the tide in our society as a whole, which tends to minimize this kind of activity. And young people, a lot of young people are just not interested in people much older than they are, and haven't developed the emotional relationships that make them loyal to a grandparent or something. And I think that's a very important part of life. I mean, to some extent, when you're an elderly person, one of the things that differentiates us from young people is that we tend to see life as a span. We tend to see people as being at a certain stage of life, and we have some notion of what they're going to be like in other stages or what they were in last. And young people tend to see the world right now, and no concept of how could they possibly put all those tattoos on, you know, how they will love Albert forever, you know, when you know perfectly well that within a year or so they're going to be involved with Stanley, you know. And, it really, I don't understand it. But people do, young people do live with a short horizon, as it were, of what counts, what's immediate. Yes.
I was wondering if we could link this to, on the handout, to number 4, this need to feel needed.
Right.
The need to feel needed,
Yeah.
which I think is a
Okay, well, that's a big subject, and I didn't want to get into that. One of the big things, of course, about stepping out of a job, even stepping out of a job partially, is that you're not as important in the line of work, or where you work, or in the area of your work as you were before. There's no way that you can retain the substance of your stature. Most of us, you know, we're identified by the line of work. I'm a psychiatrist. I mean, that's what I am regarded as. I'm a doctor. That's a certain line of work. I'm in a certain industry, the health industry, and you know, our society is divided into industries which are remarkably separate from each other in the sense that people actually know, you know, what do I know about what really goes on in the plumbing industry, for example? What do I know about what life is like really in the newspaper industry? What do I know? I don't know. I know things that are close to my own industry, as it were, and that's where I have my contacts and whatnot. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why it's very difficult for people to shift jobs, even when certain skills are needed in another industry that a person has and in plentiful supply would be very desirable. The problem is, how does he find them? How do they find him, and how does he find them? An example of this goes back to the Second World War, which kind of shows how ancient I am. When the war ended, of course, there was an enormous shipbuilding industry that collapsed overnight because you didn't need all those ships anymore. And a tremendous number of people thrown out of work from the ship yards. The highest level work in the shipbuilding industry were the guys that were the welders who went down into difficult places and welded things that you had to be a contortionist to get down there with the welding instruments and do the welding. And these guys were enormously talented, and they were paid very high salaries because they could do things that most other people could do. Well, suddenly, there was no need for them anymore. And they were out of line, and nobody realized how valuable they were. Well, it just turned out that a rather creative employment psychologist happened to have a group of people visiting him from the beer industry. And the beer industry said that the hardest kind of worker that they needed a lot was somebody who could get down in the vats and repair leaks and that sort of thing. And you know, here was a made for in heaven combination, you know. They take the shipbuilding people who were out of work, take them over to the beer industry, and all of a sudden they were very much in demand and very well paid and all that sort of thing. Our economic life is full of things like this, but we don't know much about it. And the trafficking, I mean, probably the employment agencies these days don't do very much of anything except look at what your title is and match it with some other title. They rarely do anything more creative than that. And you get paid for it, and you get respect for it, and your colleagues around know you as the person who was able to do this. Well, that collapses when you leave an organization like that. And then the issue is, how much did you need that to sustain your day-to-day self-esteem? When you find that you're sitting at home and nobody really understood what you did anyway, your family doesn't really understand what kind of skill it took at work to do what you used to do. Nobody around your home understands that. And the only people who would appreciate that are the people down where you work, because you travel down there and they don't have time to see you. Then you go back home and, you know, and they're criticizing you for having left the beer cup out in the sink, you know, instead of washing it out and that sort of thing. And that is the extent of the kind of affirmation you get at home. It doesn't meet the need. So a lot of guys collapse in that situation. They begin to think they're no good. They begin to think they're not worth anything to anybody. They begin to be hypersensitive about remarks. Or they get down to the place of work and they find somebody doesn't really have time to see them, and their feelings are hurt, and they begin to think that the guys down there are all against them. And, you know, this can evolve into quite a pyramid of emotional difficulties. So, you know, now let us say that you happen to be the kind of person who always thought that he was being, let's say, that he was practicing a little bit of a fraud, that he worked terribly hard to put on a good impression, and generally speaking, he got by it and got acclaim for the things he did, but he always thought there was something missing in there. And the truth of the matter is that the actual truth is somewhere between what he thinks inside and what people outside think. That he's probably does a lot more than he gives himself credit for, but he also, works very hard to get acclaim. Now, when he stops that process, then where does it leave him? All of a sudden, he's back on the original notion, which he was always struggling against, that he had to work extra hard to be accepted. And now he's no longer able to work extra hard, or the kind of extra hard work he doesn't produce that result anymore. Then where does that leave him? That leaves him really having to confront his basic views about himself and reset his basic goals, perhaps accept the extent of his success in his profession, and let the book be closed and say, I'm not going to argue about it, I'm not going to claim they don't appreciate me, and I'm not going to get into that. That's what it is, and I'm going to stick with that. And begin to get involved with other activities that provide a little bit of affirmation. Now that's a big psychological task, depending upon how severe the problem is. That's a big task. And some people will take a long time before they really recover to get some kind of balance in that. You've taken away the basic way in which they've been affirmed, and now they're going to find some other kind of affirmation. Well, within the home, let's say they have worked terribly hard, so they haven't been very much a presence in the home. They haven't been a big factor. They've accepted being a guest, as it were, and maybe over the years, this happens with many marriages, for example, they get pretty husband and wife get too involved in the wife on the one hand rearing children, for example, or both of them rearing children, and the husband in trying to be a success in his business, or maybe they have aged parents that they have to take care of that add to the burden, and they don't have much time to talk to each other. And I remember one couple that goes back a long time ago at Eggleston, both very successful people, two doctors. They literally had less than 5 minutes a day to talk to each other. That was the limit of their contact. What kind of relationship survives after many years of this kind of thing? I have people who are involved very much with their children, very concerned about their children. They cooperate, dealing with the children. They're dealing with the children all the time. They never go away on a weekend between themselves, just for themselves. They have a relationship between themselves because they're so worried about the children. They've got to be there all the time. I mean, this just takes up the whole life. And the question is, once you take away some of that and you're in retirement, what do you have left in the relationship? Do you really know the person that you're married to in any deep sense? That can be deadened to the point where it's very hard to revive. Maybe it's not revival. Maybe at that point people need to get a divorce and look for some other kind of, some other relationship. Or maybe it's a revival, but it's certainly going to take a lot of work to revive it. That happens a lot.
Rick, with our time moving along, would you say a little bit about physical self-maintenance and body?
Yes, there's the tyranny of the body. Yes, you got to pay attention to the body as you get older, because it requires attention. If you don't use it, you lose it, and that's all aspects of the body. And that's a discipline. And some people fret at that discipline. Some people spend an enormous amount of time in that discipline. You've got to find a way of fitting that into your life so that the necessary things you need to do to keep your physical and mental health together are done, but don't swallow up all your energies and all your creativity and that sort of thing. And I've got an easy answer to that. It's important to do aerobic exercises. For older people, walking is probably the most important thing, but there are other things. It's important to do a certain amount of weightlifting. Muscles, left unused will deteriorate much faster than they will build up when you practice it. So it's a game which the only way to win is to do something pretty consistently. And then it gets to and finally, when you get to my age, you've got to worry about balance, and because falls are probably the most drastic thing that happens to elderly people. Almost all people's decline starts with a fall, breaking something, and you have to worry about balance and exercises that reinforce balance. All those things have to be done. So the trick is, how do you motivate yourself to do that so that it comes out with some degree of consistency and does actually benefit your body? That's the real conundrum, and it's not fun, and it's not easy. But it's got to be done. If you can make it fun, if you have a sport that does a lot of this for you, that's great, as long as you can play the sport and whatnot. Any way in which you can make it fun would help. But ultimately, fun is not the only thing involved. It has to be something of a discipline. Now, interestingly enough, we know that physical exercise is necessary for the maintenance of cognitive health. We don't know that cognitive exercise is necessary for the maintenance of cognitive health. I believe it is. Problem is we haven't been able to demonstrate it. We can demonstrate it with regard to physical exercise. That actually people's memory is better, people's mental function is better when they have adequate aerobic exercise. And that probably is because of blood flow to the brain and maintenance of glucose administration. The other, I believe, is very true. Some people, of course, invoke the old nun study, about Alzheimer's, but the nuns who studied more and who read more and that sort of thing didn't get to Alzheimer's as much as their fellow nuns who were not so intellectually active. Well, the problem with that was the locus of the time of study was in the 20s. It didn't have anything to do with old people. It had to do with what they did at the age of teens and 20s. They were more intellectual then. They didn't get as much Alzheimer's later. There was nothing proved about doing the same thing when you were 60, 70, and 80 having any kind of effect that way. We think it does. We think it does, but you know, we can't prove it. Somebody in the New York Times fairly recently had an article about studying something new, something that was new to the brain as being especially stimulating to keeping the brain alive. I like that one because I was embarking on a really earnest effort to learn the nuts and bolts of Chinese characters in a way that I had never studied before. That is by being able to bring them up out of my memory without any kind of cues. And that felt like a new thing. And I said, hey, you know, I am stretching a part of my brain that has never been stretched before. Yes?
Just as a last question, I think the New York Times also had talked about bridge as being such a good activity because of the intellectually stimulating, but also the social part of it as well.
Yes, I would think that both of those things are important.
They kind of went together.
And we have to draw a little line between those things for which we have some degree of hard evidence and those things which we think are reasonable and probable. But you know, it's very difficult to prove some of these things. It takes very carefully designed studies to bring it. We just all went through the great disappointment a few years ago about vitamin E, when everybody thought that was going to be good for heart disease and all that sort of thing. Turns out when you do a really good study, there is no benefit demonstrated.
If I can make a plug, 3 years ago I was solicited and became a volunteer in the Emory Georgia Tech Predictive Health Institute study. And then I believe last year they opened up memberships in the Emory Center for Health Discovery to anybody on campus for something like $600 a year. I'm a big fan of it. So throw that out here. I think it would be well worth the cost.
What is it?
The Emory Center for Health Discovery is on the 14th floor, I think, of Crawford Lawn, downtown. And they do a massive amount of testing of your baseline body functions. And then they assign you a life coach, if you will, who checks up periodically and you set the interval that you want to. And basically, she's my nag. It keeps me honest about exercise and things. But one of the things I found at the beginning of this was that my fat to muscle ratio was far worse than I dreamed. And it was a real wake-up call. And I have become more active as a result of this. And because I'm reporting every 2 weeks what I'm doing, I'm holding my nose to the grindstone, as it were.
Well, it is a frightening statistic how fast you lose it and how slowly you get it back. And you lose it with inactivity a fairly short time. Yes.
Just a comment, it seems to me one of the great advantages of being retired is that finally you have time to exercise. When I was working full-time, I never seemed to be able to get it in.
That should be. But I think, important as that is, I think one has to be loose as to how one's going to expend the time. And you may find, as many retired people do, they're just as busy as they ever were. And it's just as hard to fit in the regular, because you have to take advantage of opportunities. You know, that isn't necessarily going to come always at the time that you did your regular push-ups in the morning or that sort of thing. Are we running out of time?
We have maybe just a minute or two more.
Okay.
And I know we've asked you to stand up for a very long time while we're all sitting down, so.
I would think.
He's getting the exercise.
Go ahead.
Are there further questions? We can take another minute or two. We do want to end on time if we can. And we want to ask you also if you would fill out the blue evaluation form. That would be very helpful too. but we can continue it further.
Can we have a review of one thing? I don't remember, I have a note here and I don't have an answer. How about retreat outside the home? And then I think we got diverted, or did I miss?
How about-
Did you answer that? The importance of a retreat
Retreat
outside
the home?
I think we did.
A lot of them don't have that, you know, they used to have it when they worked, they don't
Yeah.
have it afterwards. I think that just has to be something you think about, and you think within yourself about it. Because very frequently we just go along with the flow, whatever is available, instead of figuring out what we need and experimenting with what we need.
Here's a question.
I just want to make a comment. I think your point is very well taken about married couples who've been married a long time and then, you know, have retirement and the relationship and change and et cetera. But I probably motivated by my own personal circumstances. I recently, maybe 5 years ago, entered a relationship with somebody. And at the time that we started our relationship, he was retired, I was not, but I am now retired. And so we've gone through this thing about, you know, who does what around the house and blah, blah, blah. But the nice thing about it is, it's not based on a 45-year history that we have of how we did it
You have a lot of
45 years
flexibility that
ago.
you might not have.
So it's I mean, I think some things are comparable, but I think it's probably easier. I think the negotiation process is probably easier.
Well, it sounds as if
Don't
you
have that long
were
history.
working on it, that you actually did something, you actually talked about it, maybe,
We negotiated
experimented.
it, et cetera.
And that's what I think is necessary, whether you've been married for 45 years or whether you've been married for 5. It's necessary to think about the changes, their impact on the way in which you live, and how it should affect the way in which you relate to each other. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more, because you mentioned how difficult some people find when they retire, of losing the affirmation of the job, their own self-respect. They're so tied into their job, that's their source of self-affirmation.
Right.
And you said, what I heard you say is, you just sort of have to sit back and accept that your achievements.
Well, some of them are still tied up in their job and debating about whether they were good or whether they should have been more successful or less successful.
Right, so let's accept that.
That needs to be closed down. Some people, that's hard to close down, because they have a lot of feelings about it. Yeah, but on the other hand, they need to find other sources of affirmation.
Right.
Now, one very important source of affirmation is right within the home. That is, whether you're willing to begin to be important in a different way to people who live in the home. The children, maybe grandchildren, or maybe a spouse, or maybe a friend. So that some affirmation comes from personal relationships. Basically, in the long run, that's where most of our satisfaction comes from. But it may require a whole different style of relating. You're no longer the boss. You do other things. And that shift is important, but it may take a while for it to make that shift. They need a lot of help. Is it from the others in the family, or
For what?
maybe from others in the family? They need help in doing that.
Yeah.
They can't do that entirely alone. Either from others in the family or friends or whatever is available.
We need to break off. I know you'll join me in thanking Rick for this very stimulating. We have a little present here to help you stimulate yourself with a little more reading.
Oh, okay.
We feel that would perhaps be helpful.
Oh, thank you very much.
As you continue on. Thank you all, and please note the form here that tells the upcoming 2 events.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.